I want to welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. I am Jamie Lord, the Director of Government Affairs for Georgia Family Council. That's a throwback we were just talking about, Georgia Center for Opportunity. And I am so thrilled today to be having a conversation with Governor Jeb Bush from Florida and our good friend, President and CEO of Georgia Center for Opportunity, Randy Hicks. Part of the reason I'm so excited about this particular conversation is we're going to be talking about education and innovations and what things need to look like as we move forward. And some of you that are joining the call that may have less familiarity with GCO may wonder why we're talking about this topic, and particularly why we're talking to Governor Bush about this topic. And I'd like to kind of start answering those two questions to frame up our conversation before we really get into the meat of it. So really, to the first point, I've been working with GCO specifically on education, specifically education reform and school choice initiatives for, gosh, Randy, 13, 14 years by now. And so maybe, Randy, if you could weigh in a little bit about why education has always been such a key initiative for GCO and why it's such a cornerstone of the rest of the work that we do as well, before we kind of pivot into more of the substance of our chat today.
Gladly we'll do that. So friends of GCO have been around us a while, recognize some of this and hopefully much of it. But really our work revolves around what might be called the defining American idea, that everyone should have an opportunity, regardless of race or the circumstances of their birth, to achieve a better life, to achieve their potential, to flourish. And what we have done as an organization is we've focused our work on three areas: education, employment, and family formation. Some of you will recognize that those are the three issues of what's called the success sequence, which is based on research that was done years ago by Bell Sawhill and Ron Haskins at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And essentially, what the success sequence research shows is that of all the adults in America who've at least graduated from high school, found steady employment, and waited till they were 21 to marry and have kids, only 2% are living in poverty at this point. Of those adults who've gotten those three things wrong, it's 75% who are living in poverty at this moment in time. So those are the three issues we're focusing on. I'll just make this clear. That success sequence I just described, that's just a simple picture of complex realities. There are all sorts of underlying factors that keep people from getting the education they need, the employment they need, and even forming the family that they need, the family they want. So the first thing I mentioned, though, is education. And it is a key predictor of whether or not somebody is going to have that opportunity to flourish. So what we've been focusing on for really a couple decades, and more successfully over the past 13 or 14 years, as Jamie mentioned, is increasing access to quality academic options for the disadvantaged. And because we're focused on that, because that's one of the key building blocks of a flourishing life, we thought there wasn't anybody better to talk to about it from a reform perspective than Governor Jeb Bush. Governor Bush spearheaded, in my professional life, I've never seen a governor accomplish more on education reform than Governor Bush did in Florida. So Governor, welcome. We're grateful for the time you're taking to speak to us and speak to our friends.
Thank you, Randy, and thank you, Jamie. It's a joy to be back with you all, talking about something that we're all passionate about.
Absolutely. I remember in 2007, I was lobbying, I guess, on behalf of GCO to create our state's first private school choice program, our Georgia Special Needs Scholarship. And at that time, I guess that was about the year you were leaving office. Is that right, Governor?
They kicked me out the door in 2007.
Yeah. Which is too bad. But in our business and the policy world, so often it's not so much a matter of coming up with, a brand new, amazing idea that no one's heard of. Sometimes it's looking across the country or across the world and saying, wow, that's working, that's amazing, let's go do something similar that makes sense for our state. And for us in Georgia, certainly during your tenure as governor, but even since then, because of the legacy that you created, we're often looking to Florida to do exactly what Randy was talking about. And I think 3 words that he mentioned were really important. And it was access, quality, and options. And you really tackled, I second what Randy said, you're the rare leader of a state that is both thoughtful about these issues, but also extremely bold and just willing to tackle and go all the way, as far as you could possibly go to bring about accountability, but also the most robust school choice programs really in the country. So I guess to start, I would just say, looking back, not only at your time as governor, but maybe even since then through your work at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, what are some of the highlights for you about what you were able to accomplish for students?
Well, I'd say that the highlight for me is the fact that we built a team of policymakers. So it wasn't a Jeb deal. It was the right thing to do, and it's sustainable. Even last year, Governor DeSantis signed the most meaningful expansion of private school choice in the country. And that's like the 10th iteration of what was started in 1999. And I think that for policymakers and people involved in advocacy like you all are, that's the lesson. The lesson is if you're not moving forward, eventually atrophy sets in and you're moving backwards. And so you got to constantly be moving the ball forward. Jamie, you were actively involved in the special needs scholarship in Georgia. That was modeled, I think, after the McKay Scholarship in Florida. And it's a pretty powerful idea that very few people can actually argue against if you think about it. If you, as Randy talks about family life, it's hard as a mom who loves their child with their heart and soul and sees the struggles of an exceptional ed kid. The federal government empowers that mother and dad, hopefully there too, with federal law to back them up. They have to create an individual education plan with the school district. Prior to my arrival as governor, I heard from so many parents saying that I'm in litigation with the school district because my child's not getting the proper education. So we listened to that and we created a simple plan that says if your IEP, if your individual education plan is not being met, you can go to a private school with the state and local dollars, plain and simple. No arguing. And guess what happened? The public schools, fearing that they were going to lose the revenue from these 30,000 kids that went to private schools, that there would be additional ones, got really good at educating kids with special needs. And moms and dads had a choice between a better quality public school and a private option. That was built in partnership with policymakers. It was a good idea, I think, and I advocated for it, but the president of the Senate was the biggest advocate. And now we have the Gardner Scholarship Program that we're spending $180 million to expand this to other parts of the education experience. So that's the lesson. The lesson is when you pass something, don't check the box, build on it. Success is never final, reform is never complete. And if you do believe, as I know you do with your heart and soul, that every person in this country ought to have a chance to rise up, that we need to give them the tools to do so, and that the policies around them give them the same chance that people that live outside of poverty have that chance, then it has to be a sustained effort over a generation, not just one legislative session.
I have so many questions to ask, but I also want to make mention that if our listeners have questions while we're having this conversation, there's a Q&A button, or there should be anyway in your window. Feel free to click on that and pose a question, or if you would rather pose it in the chat, feel free, and we will try to get to as many as we can throughout our conversation. But Governor Butch, just thinking about what you said about if we're not moving forward, eventually atrophy sets in. And it seems to be my experience looking out in like traditional public education that can happen really quickly. Just that things have always been done a certain way, and therefore that is how they continue, and that it can be really difficult to think about innovation or figuring out new and creative ways to meet a student's needs. However, we've had this COVID-19 situation that sort of forced everybody home for a time, and there's still some uncertainties, I guess, about what school might look like if and when things reopen in the fall. So a lot of parents, maybe for the first time ever, got an experience with a choice, or not a choice really, but a mandate to do things differently. And And I think the results have been somewhat inconsistent. It seems like some folks had a great experience and others maybe missing out on a fair amount of learning, from the end of the spring. So I guess I'm just curious from what you've seen and heard, what's going well and what is cause for concern?
I'd say by and large, first of all, I'd say government-run monopolies don't go quietly into the night. You have to put pressure on them. And the best in K-12 education, the best pressure is empowering parents to make choices for their children. Because these are good people inside of bad systems. And the system is organized around the economic interests of the adults. And you can be an incredibly passionate, dedicated teacher, but the simple fact is any kind of disruption of this monopoly system where you collectively bargain with a government-run agency where everybody benefits by that collective bargaining process is not going to yield the kind of dynamic intervention that we need. So a crisis always is an opportunity to be able to, a disruption like this is an opportunity to think differently. And I think parents, the experience that they've gone through, most of which has not been good. It's been good to be connected with your children and understand the learning. That's probably a very powerful education that they've done. But how the schools have responded to this across the country, I would say, is most people would recognize it not so good. And so there's some lessons learned, and now parents being informed and empowered, I think, can be a real, can play a provocative and important role of change. So I would suggest a few things. One, schools need to train for this. In Florida, we are unfortunately in the middle of a hurricane zone. And so most of the districts here had been training for going online. Miami-Dade County it's the fourth largest school district in the United States. They didn't miss a beat. Within 24 hours, they were operational. They had plans to get devices in the hands of low-income families. They created hot spots, hot zones, for Wi-Fi. The teachers were trained. And so I think that needs to be one of the lessons, that every school district in this country needs to start planning and training and start having online days so that teachers can be training and parents can, the learning lessons don't atrophy, that they're actually involved. It may be that we go to distance learning for half the students one week and half the next week in order to create social distancing. Some districts are considering doing that. And so I'm not suggesting everything's going to be online, but I do think a hybrid form of learning would be powerful. And here's the transition from dealing with a disruption to what could be going forward. Imagine a system of learning where time is the variable and learning's the constant. And imagine flipping the system on its head where homework is done in school and schoolwork is done at home. And where you learn, you're empowered to make a student and parents are much more responsible for the learning, and teachers then are guiding that process and helping remediate in the classroom the stuff that kids don't learn. That kind of system will allow students to socialize going forward, because that's an important part of K-12 education. It'll allow parents to go to work, which is really important because we can't be paralyzed. And it could allow for this social injustice that now is kind of commonplace that people talk about. The greatest social injustice in America today is that some kids have the power, have reached their God-given abilities to learn, and some kids don't. That is shameful. And we create these huge gaps because we push kids along that haven't learned the material, and we hold kids back that could learn at a faster rate. And so my hope and prayer actually is that this disruption of people's lives, which has created so much hardship for so many people, will create the catalyst to move to this competency-based learning that is customized, where parents are much more empowered to help their students learn.
No, that's really
interesting.
The one thing, one thing that we talk about a lot, Governor, at GCO, is that oftentimes when we talk about, when we as a society talk about education reform, oftentimes we talk about it as being, as the effects of it kicking in over a number of years. And the thing we often mention is that the problem with that is you have kids who have to hit milestones every week, every month, every semester. And so when we sit and we wait for reforms to kick in, we're losing kids to these missed milestones. So we talk about immediate access quite a bit at GCO, because it's not just that kids should have access. We need an immediate intervention to give kids immediate access so they don't fall further behind. One of the things that makes me think about is what you accomplished in Florida in terms of outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about the outcomes that you're most proud of? And again, you can include those other partners at the legislative level who helped you make that happen. But what are you most proud of?
So first of all, without outcomes, reforms die. They have to work. Why would people want them if they're not working, right? So it's a suite of reforms that yielded significant gains. We were the first state to grade schools A through F, totally transparent. Moms know what an F is and what an A is, and they want A's, not F's. We eliminated social promotion in third grade. If you were a below basic reader in third grade, you were held back. First year, there were like 12% of all third graders were held back. But we saw an explosion of innovations around this. And so pre-K to 3, strategies were developed. We put reading coaches in every school, low-income schools particularly. We taught teachers how to teach reading. And the net result of parental choice for public and private options and robust accountability created the greatest learning gains in the last 30 years in the country. We were 50th out of 50 in our graduation rate in 1998. I mean, generally, Georgia, probably there's kind of a joke in some of the states, you kind of whisper, thank God for, name your favorite state that someone's below you. Everybody was saying, thank God for Florida. We were literally 50% graduation rate. We had an 8th grade level high school graduation test. It was embarrassing. And so by putting pressure on the system and funding adequately these programs and creating school choice, Florida went from 50th to above the national average now. We've had consistent gains since 1999. But more importantly to me, because you get a high school diploma doesn't necessarily mean you're college or career ready. It just means in some places, you've just been breathing enough on 190 days, each year to graduate. But in the NAEP test, the nation's report card, in 1997, I think it was, Florida was 29th out of 31 on the 4th grade reading and something similar on the 8th grade reading. And 10 years later, with all of these reforms kicking in and just kind of dogged determination, beating back the forces that didn't want to change, we were 6th out of 50 states. Florida's low-income kids are at the top of the heap. Florida's African-American kids, Florida's Hispanic kids are in the top 5. Kids with learning disabilities, Florida's top 5 generally in the 4th grade and 8th grade reading, and we've seen improvement in math as well. That's what I'm proud of. When you think about it, you're totally right about if you have we were always confronted, should we phase this in over 3 years? Oh my God, this is so unfair. You're changing the system. Should we phase it in over 3 years? And my attitude was, let's do it retroactively. Fairness is in the eye of the beholder. Is it fair to have a kid be a 3rd grade level reader in 8th grade? Is it fair to trap people in poverty because they haven't been able to garner a proper education? I think that is completely unjust and unfair. So we acted quickly, we stuck with it, and we had these big learning gains that sustained the rest of the reforms. Without the learning gains, I was praying the rosary the night before the NAEP scores came out, each time they came out, because, if it didn't work, it was clear that the legislatures and school districts and others would abandon this kind of reform. Little by little, the people that opposed it became neutralized. Those that hated it, continued to dislike it. But we garnered support because we had great learning gains.
I want to talk a little bit more about this because the results are plain to see. I mean, it is black and white, unambiguous. Some of these types of ideas have been in place for a long time now, so it's no longer a theory about how it will work. We know what it looks like in Florida and even in other places that have tried to replicate pieces. I don't know of another state that's kind of done it all, at once in a package deal. But I think the frustrating thing for somebody like me in my job, where I'm dealing with legislators, governors, elected officials, policymakers, et cetera, is that even though the results are plain and successful, it is still impossible sometimes to get some of these policies passed. It's remarkably difficult. And I kind of want to talk through a little bit about, why is it that so few leaders tackle these things with thoughtfulness and boldness as you have? And I'm not trying to be critical, but what's the issue here, and what do we do about it? Because despite the successes, it's not as though every state in the nation is running out trying to replicate, some of these things.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think things have changed. I think now our politics is different. In the early 2000s, when I was governor, my natural instinct was to find someone that looked different than me, that may have a different view on everything else, but on this one issue, they agreed that we needed to do something different, not just in education, but across the board. Kind of create the Nixon to China mentality to constantly try to bring people together. That was our natural impulse back then. Now, everything is so hyper politicized and hyper partisan that seems harder. And so good people in positions of responsibility will do some of what they know they should be doing, but are cautious about, getting caught in this quagmire, this incredibly dangerous, I think, in my mind, hyper partisanship. So the first step would be find the one thing that you have in common with someone and work on that and kind of build back this consensus orientation. In my experience is that most people, if you make the case, as we talked about with students with special needs, there's a constituency for that now. They're not going to take that away. Low-income kids in Florida can go to private schools or charter schools, and the charter school communities, reach scale. It's got probably 12, 15% of all students now go to charter schools. The private school choice programs now total maybe 8% government funded, or indirectly or directly, are going to private schools. Those low-income families, they're not going to take that away now. And now people, liberals that may disagree on a bunch of stuff, now support private school choice because it's been proven to work. So I think the first thing is to tear down the barriers, and when you agree with someone that you may not agree on everything else, work on it. And for the life of me, I find this is my same frustration, Jamie, because we probably work in 30 states, 35 states, and I find really good people. I deal with the governors a lot. These are good men and women, but they don't have that natural impulse because our political system is very different right now, and we need to rebuild it. And the final thing I'd say about that is you're not going to get it out of DC. So we're at our best, we're a bottom-up country. Strong families, strong communities, local and state policymakers can solve this problem, and we can't wait for Washington to get fixed. We'll fix it by strengthening our own systems at the local and state level.
Hey, Governor, quick observation from what you just said. So much of what you said certainly reflects, is consistent with our experience in terms of how you get things done. This is not a partisan issue to us. Academic outcomes are not a partisan issue. I think one of the other things that happens when you start talking about education is that there is this very binary way of looking at it. Either you're for public education or you're for school choice. And that goes both ways. There are people who are frustrated when you start working on the school choice side. You're starting to work on public school reforms that you think will improve the delivery of education and the delivery of academic services in public schools, and they'll get upset. It can work both ways. The story you've told about Florida is a story of great success for the public school system. It illustrates, which I think is so important, the fact that it's not one or the other. We actually need both, because ultimately, getting back to the test scores you mentioned, it's about academic outcomes for kids, and they improved across the board in the state of Florida. So I say that more, not even necessarily as a question, though you may want to say something about that, but it's certainly an observation from your work and something we've seen here as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Two stories. One, when I was campaigning in 1998, I went to a high school. A kid was studying in the lab. Back then, the computers had those little green screens. It was that long ago. And he was studying for the HSCT test, the high school graduation test. And the question, I looked over his shoulder, the question was, a baseball game starts at 3, it ends at 4:30, how long's the game? And he couldn't answer. This was the 3rd time he was taking that test. Now, I'm a data-driven guy, I love data, I'm geeky as all get out. But I think the first lesson is, there should be outrage. There should be outrage for his last name was Santiago. I think his first name was Fred Santiago. There should be outrage for that child. Because I asked if that child had come to the United States recently. No, he was a product of the Seminole County, Florida system for his entire time. And who's marching in the streets for him? So one of the things I think we have to do is to turn this on its head and make this about students and about their families. To empower them, we have to give them a quality education. And there should be no excuses, none, for something like that. That was the catalyst, by the way, that compelled me to raise the graduation test to a 10th grade level, which is still kind of pathetic if you think about it. You know, you're graduating from 12th grade, it ought to be at a 12th grade level, but at least we raised the accountability. Second story, Berkeley school district in Berkeley, California, did not implement their digital learning plan when people went into quarantine, because the attitude that I read, at least from the superintendent and the school district, was if we can't educate everybody, we're not going to educate anybody. Shameful. This is not all about data. This is about the morality of excusing away why kids, particularly low-income kids, don't learn. This should make people angry. This should generate philanthropy. This should be, I mean, it's wonderful that Reed Hastings is making this massive donation to the historically Black colleges. Kudos to him. But it would be nice for someone to say, I'm gonna fork out $250 million to have I'm not kidding, strategy to deal with the achievement gap. And he's done that too, by the way, with charter schools. So I'm not wrong person to be critical of, but the point being, we should have people, instead of getting into these arguments that are all about symbols, we're tearing down statues, we should be saying, a child in this country, the greatest country on the face of the earth, should have the right to graduate from high school in 12 years with a 12th grade level education that makes them college ready or career ready. That should be the objective for every kid, to reach their God-given abilities, and move away from this as a political argument and make it into a moral one.
I agree with
Powerful. I'm curious about your thoughts kind of along those lines about what accountability looks like in this, COVID era. I know at least in our state, there have already been calls from our Department of Education to sort of do away with testing for a year, to change how teachers are evaluated, et cetera. And I know that there can be sort of meaningless and too many tests sometimes, but at the same time, if we're not keeping track of how children are progressing, then how do we know that we're giving them that education that you just outlined? So I guess I'm curious about your thoughts on what accountability can and should look like, given that circumstances are a little strange right now.
If you see this as the catalyst for potential change, our accountability system could be different in that if you master the material, you move on. So you have to have an assessment to know if you've mastered that building block to get to the next one. Ultimately, we need to have accountability for sure. It should be, in a 21st century system, customized for each student. That's my own view. I'd love to see if 25% of juniors, as a recent study suggests, could take college level work. I'd like to see 25% of juniors taking college level work. And if we have these huge gaps of kids being pushed along, we should eliminate that gap. And so moving to a more customized competency-based model would require a different accountability system. But the idea that, wow, this is such a struggle, A, we should be training and planning for these things going forward. And B, you can adjust the accountability. Maybe the accountability should be to measure in the fall to see what the gaps are, you know, how much atrophy set in during the spring and the summer, but we shouldn't eliminate accountability. We can have fewer tests, but make them more meaningful for sure. Let me give you an example. In 2004, we had 4 hurricanes and 2 tropical storms. We had school districts that lost almost all their schools. Charlotte County on August 13th, 2004 was hit by Hurricane Charlie, and half the schools were wiped out for the foreseeable future. There was calls to eliminate the FCAT, our state test. That was in August, eliminated for that year. And I said, heck no. That'll only be a disservice for the low-income kids that, you know, need to have accountability so that there's a focus on their needs as much as kids that are in affluent communities. And the net result was, in the hurricane impacted school districts, they did better than the districts that were not impacted by the hurricane. Why was that? Because people rolled up their sleeves and teachers just said, we're going to make this happen, and principals led. And they did all of this because there was a sense of urgency. And we provided support, and we didn't abandon them. But the idea that you say life's not fair, we're not going to measure success or failure, I think almost guarantees that you'll have more failure.
We've got a question from one of our listeners, and that has to do with the Janus decision, Supreme Court decision on public sector unions and what effect that's had on education. Obviously, Georgia is a right to work state, and yet, you know, the practicality at the state capitol is that, you know, anytime we come with reforms or choice, the de facto unions, you know, the associations of superintendents, teachers, school board members, et cetera, all mobilize, you know, to scare legislators that the entire education community is against this, while at the same time, I know many public school teachers, one of them happens to be my mother, recently retired, who just on a personal level don't see this stuff as a threat. They got into education so that they could help students learn. And if that, you know, looks different for a student in another setting, then why would they stand in the way of that? And yet the voices that represent those interests by and large communicate often not entirely truthfully about what's happening, but, you know, they're able to make a big scene. So I guess I'm curious about your thought to this question. Has it helped awaken teachers to the idea that they do not have to accept the status quo and can reach higher, speaking of this Janus decision?
Absolutely. I mean, more in states that, unlike Georgia and Florida, that aren't right to work states. I think the Janus decision has been very helpful. Remember that the teachers unions, which is a great term for them, but, you know, by and large, half of the people that they represent are teachers, right? I mean, they're working in the school system. So it's definitely weakens the public unions are weaker when they can't collect mandatory fees. It's the right thing to do in my mind. But we need to make the argument about, we need to be pro-teacher along the way here when you're talking about reforms. This is not anti-teacher, this is a pro-teacher idea. Governor DeSantis today is signing a bill that is going to make Florida, you know, this is subject to a big budget question that I'm not sure how he's going to handle given COVID-19, but the law that was passed that he originated was his idea, was to create beginning pay in Florida as the second highest in the United States. And he's signing that today. And at the same time, he continues to advocate for expanding charter schools and expanding voucher programs. And that's the way I think it should be. We should be supportive of teachers. We should be supportive of parents, all focused on making sure a child gets a year's worth of knowledge in a year's time. So I've never, you know, it was always frustrating that the union was the one that opposed everything that we proposed. I mean, even I proposed something similar to what Governor DeSantis got passed, and they were opposed to it. It made no sense to me. They mortgaged their building in my reelection to fund my opponent's campaign. Unfortunately, I was reelected, but it's a struggle. You got to put on your big boy pants and big girl pants if you want to win these debates.
Governor, one of the questions we've been asked is this from Rick Graber. Most large city public school systems across the country are failing in our promise to provide a good education for all. Why has there not been a national uproar demanding change? And again, you've addressed a little bit of this, and it may be related to our last, just what you were talking about, but why isn't there a national uproar about how we're failing kids?
It's the great frustration that I have, because, you know, first of all, there's the results are generally bad. The inequities that exist are quiet. You know, per student funding and typically in lower income communities, not necessarily districts, but lower income communities, if you had school-based budgeting, you would find that the teachers are generally more junior teachers that get paid less. And so I would argue that what we ought to be focusing on is making sure that there's equality in funding, that we have robust accountability, and that everybody be held to account. But these are powerful economic interests in these communities, and they fight back and they excuse away why students can't learn. I don't have a great answer. I'll tell you, you know, when I first got involved in all this, I thought that Florida's school district system was not a good one because it was too bureaucratic. We had 67 districts instead of 500. I got to appreciate the fact that there's 67 districts because there is more equality of funding. And in the big districts, there's scale. And so, you know, the academic outcomes of Miami-Dade County are, for a large school district, the best in the country. And Broward County is not that far behind, nor is Hillsborough. So you can move the needle and have the resources necessary to be successful. And so I've grown to appreciate them a little bit more. And frankly, having like all of Hillsborough be one district means that the leaders of the community are also in that school district. They don't have their separate little fancy suburban school district where their kids are doing great. And, you know, there are places up north that have school districts that look like private schools, and they you know, they love it. And 10 miles away, there are kids that are living, you know, in poverty, abject poverty, where they're not getting a quality education. So somehow we need to move to equalize this, and this should be something that the adults in the system should embrace, but they don't.
One of the questions we've had is really what we might do to address some of the learning loss that you mentioned. Both some of that happens naturally over the summer, of course, but certainly having a shutdown right before summer, I think a lot of people are concerned about the academic losses that students are suffering. You know, what are your thoughts about what students and parents and policymakers can do to catch kids up for the fall? And maybe, you know, more specifically, some think tanks and even some other states are proposing sort of a back on track education savings account type program, perhaps even using CARES Act funding to fund some of that so that parents can access the resources, you know, be it tutors or, you know, online materials to catch their kids up and get back on track. What do you think about that or other ideas?
That idea is a fantastic idea, and we have been proposing ideas like that to basically create a, you know, enhanced summer school experience for kids that have been identified as struggling prior to the pandemic, and then, you know, obviously in some districts never getting even access to education for 3 months. Other ideas are to recognize that this is not going to go away. Hopefully, you know, we'll have a V-shaped recovery, but we've seen spikes in infections in Florida and other places. We have to have our schools open, but we're going to have to train for this new reality. And it may be for a longer period of time than what people hope. So there should be more focus on teacher development. There needs to be a national strategy to deal with the digital divide. In a country like ours, with the resources we have, it seems to me that we ought to be able to figure out how do you get Wi-Fi or some access to the internet with a device to every child, where teachers are trained to make sure that they understand the differences between classroom education and digital learning, and how we immerse digital learning into the classroom experience. That should be a big, you know, what I would call a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And if we're talking about an infrastructure bill in Washington, maybe the, you know, building out our digital infrastructure, focusing on learning, could be one element of that. So I think it's going to have to be a whole array of approaches, but you've brought up a great point, Jamie, which is that in whatever the first or second stimulus package that came down to states, the education commissioners and governors have a pretty good slug of dough. And the advice that I would give is invest in a strategy. Don't fill a hole. Invest in a proposal and use that money to spur on additional resources from philanthropy and from business and from individuals to be able to create a strategy. And then once you create a strategy, create the aspirational goal and measure it, and then build on that. I mean, I don't know, I guess I've spent too much time in business. A lot of times in politics, it really is a check the box kind of moment where you just, okay, I'm for this, I check the box, now I'm gonna go to another food group and talk about that. These big ideas require a full-blown strategy and where you're using resources across the board. And this would be the ideal time to do that as it relates to the digital divide.
I would actually like to invite both of you to weigh in on this question. And I recognize that I'm asking two white dudes to weigh in on this, but over the last few weeks, our country's been having a really important conversation about racial justice and equity. And I know that we've talked a little bit around that in this conversation about how there really is just a divide. Some kids have access to good education and therefore, you know, outcomes later in life, and some kids don't. And those kids can literally be 3 miles apart from each other and having a very different reality. And a lot of that, you know, certainly starts at home, but, you know, our first intervention sometimes is in the classroom, being able to help turn things around, write the success sequence, I guess, to Randy's opening. But I guess I invite both of you and Randy to kind of talk through this a little bit. What is the nexus really, you know, as we talk about what's right and just and education and how we do that rightly and justly?
Well, first of all, there is racism in our country. There always has been, but the progress of African Americans in this country is irrefutable as well. The majority of African Americans are in the middle class. There's been enormous differences. I grew up, I'm an older person, as you can tell. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I remember going to Foley's department store, which I think is now Macy's, and was shocked at, you know, the age of 6 or 7 seeing colored only water fountains in downtown Houston, which is now one of the most progressive cities in America, with an African-American mayor. And a Hispanic chief of police and a majority minority city council. There have been huge gains across the spectrum, but that's not to say, to deny that there isn't racism. The question is, where do we focus our efforts? I mean, the issue of related to police, there's some tangible, specific things that can be done, and they ought to do them for sure. And education, in my mind, that is the single most. If you had to pick one thing to do, is to deal with the inequities as it relates to education outcomes. If you assume that every child has a God-given ability, and it's up to us to organize around them to assure that they reach that God-given ability, then let's do it. If you want to deal with these issues rather than just talking about them or tearing down statues or protesting, everybody has the right to protest, but this is the time to develop strategies to deal with the issue once and for all.
So I would agree with the governor. I mean, obviously, racism does exist. There are still inequities out there in the system. Systemic inequities that have to be addressed. I'll say this, the reason why I became passionate about school choice 20 years ago mostly had to do with kids in urban environments, mostly of color, who were being basically sequestered in a place where the rest of us didn't have to see their existence, and they weren't thriving. And we were very comfortable with that, it seemed. Nobody had the moral will to tackle the issue. And that's why we continue to talk about that question of immediate access. You know, it's easy. This is one of the things that over the past few weeks has frustrated me. There are people who are finding it easier to just say something than to actually talk about what they're going to do to change the lack of access to things like a quality education, which, as the governor said, is where it largely begins. And then obviously we've got other issues. We need people in the commercial and social mainstream of life flourishing. And so, but I would say, I think school choice is absolutely, shouldn't say that. It's school choice and accountability, what the governor talked about previously. It's not just about the ability to go to private schools. It's actually creating a system, a mix of public and private options and solutions that give kids the greatest opportunity to succeed.
I'd add one other thing, which has become more apparent to me in the last few years, which is that this is an issue of class as well. This is not, it's low-income families have challenges that the rest of us can't understand. And that could be white low-income families and Hispanic low-income families. And it starts with one of the tenets of what you all deal with each and every day, which is how do we rebuild strong, loving, wholesome family life as the organizing principle in our society? When we have today, 30 years ago, I think it was, whites, out of wedlock birth rates among whites was 6%. Today it's 32. Hispanics is now up to 55, and African-American families have been altered now for several generations. What a struggle it is for a single mom to be able to provide for their families, love their children, keep them safe, and be a strong advocate for their child's education. We need to make sure that there's support and connect back, because Randy's absolutely right. We now live lives that are in these, as Mr. Murray says in Coming Apart, we live lives, people live in these super zip codes where they hang out with people that have similar education outcomes, similar incomes, and we don't connect with the rest of America. And we're seeing what the effects of that is now. And so I believe we need to have a broader conversation. Certainly race is an issue for sure, but and historically it's definitely been something that is a mark on our history. But we need to reconnect America in many ways and stop creating these bubbles to protect us and re-engage. Act on our sense of consciousness again.
I'm going to ask you a little bit about education funding and what role that can play in either being the problem or helping be part of the solution. And I know every state has a different education funding formula. Maybe that's problematic. Certainly in our state and many others, a good chunk of that is based on local property tax revenue, which can contribute to this inequity about how schools are funded. What do you see as the role of education funding, and how could we change that to be more student-centric and focusing on what's best for a student and their outcomes, as opposed to just sort of a largely income-based formula that further creates this divide?
Well, I think you answered the question. It needs to be a student-centered funding system, and it should be equal. And that's hard because if you're adding to some students' funding in this system that we have, you're taking away from some other. So it has to be done elegantly. But Florida Florida's one of the few states that actually, many years ago, not during my time, has created a fairly equal funding system where the sales tax dollars, general revenue dollars from the state, and property tax dollars are merged together and redistributed in a way that creates some differences based on cost of living, but a fairly equal funding formula. And I think that's the first step, is to create an equal funding formula. The second is, when you have a good idea that you want to invest, make that the first thing that you invest in, not the last thing. Reforms need to be funded first. That's my view. And so if you fund your reforms and put money behind it, it makes it easier for people to embrace those reforms. So from a policy point of view, if you don't, if you're not in the funding formula, for example, now in Florida, you can be a policeman and a teacher and take state monies dollar for dollar and go to a private school. We've created a voucher system inside the funding formula for the middle class. It's growing. That kind of policy is putting your policy first and foremost to get the desired result. And so even in tough times, you mentioned the CARES Act money. Use that money to begin the process of funding significant reforms that people can then see. I think part of the challenge is people fear the unknown. If they don't see it, they get nervous. They're told by others that you're taking away something or you're hurting somebody, and people don't want to deal with that. But if they can see the tangible result, they'll embrace it.
Randy, I know we're coming up on an hour here. Are there any other questions or comments that you'd like to weigh in as we kind of...
I'm kind of scrolling through some of the questions. And one of the things I do want to say, and this is a common concern expressed by Black Americans right now, and that is the concern about, when we say making great strides, are we at risk of dismissing very real concerns? And from a personal perspective, I would say I don't think we are, but I understand why people may feel that way. I think when we talk about great strides, we're simply talking about some areas of progress. But the reality is, and I believe the governor would agree with me on this as well, there is still so much to be done. And it's partly why we're on this call. It's because kids, a lot of poor kids of color are the ones who suffer most from the lack of access to quality education. So we actually are on this call largely because we want to address this very issue of inequity. So I'll say that, and I know there's much more that could be said, and we could have a call.
Let me be clear. When I said that great strides been made, great strides from 1960, where we had segregated schools, where it was separate but equal, where there was overt systemic discrimination against African Americans, irrespective of anything. That through changes in laws and through protests and through efforts made across the society we've seen significant gains. Having said that, we still have racism, and we still have these outcomes in education and other elements of life that should be unacceptable in a great country like ours. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
By the way, we just have some great questions here. We've had some very intelligent question askers. Governor, one question for you. I have a question for Jamie to kind of close it up, but one question for you. This is a common concern that's expressed, especially by teachers, but not exclusively so. And that is, how much should we be emphasizing student testing as opposed to the value of aspirational and inspirational instruction?
Well, I don't think that's either or. A good test measures how students are learning, plain and simple. When school districts over-test and make it a rote experience and it narrows the teaching experience, we should change that. Tests should be diagnostic. Parents should know what the test results are in a form that they can understand so that they can be part of the effort to remediate any challenges. Test scores and assessments should come back prior to the end of the year so that teachers know how they were successful and how the next, August or September, that teacher in the next grade knows where that student stands. So I think it needs to be extraordinarily more diagnostic, and it should not narrow the teaching or learning experience. And you can do that. This is not, it's not an either or thing at all. But what we can't do, if you're focused on, particularly on lower income communities, what you can't do is to say, we're gonna eliminate testing. We know what happens when that happens. The kids that are struggling are gonna be left behind. And we'll excuse away why they can't learn, as though something in their DNA makes it impossible for them not to have a lights out education experience. There are too many phenomenal examples all across this country of low-income kids doing extraordinary learning because they're in a different environment. And without accountability, it would doom the kids that most need the help.
Right. So Jamie, a question for you. This was one of the first questions we actually got. I'm curious to know what bipartisan efforts exist in the state of Georgia to help expand school choice and hold all schools to a high standard. I recognize that certain parties are more hesitant about charter schools and many barriers need to be broken down. Well, you're at the Capitol, you talk to people on both sides of the aisle. Why don't you talk a little bit about what's going on in the state of Georgia?
Yeah, and it was a selfish question that I asked Governor Bush earlier, which is, how can Florida get all this stuff done and it be so remarkably difficult in other places? And I'm not saying it wasn't remarkably difficult there. I think the difference, of course, at least during Governor Bush's time in Florida, is that there was a strong executive leader who had a vision for what to accomplish and was able to bring people along to realize that for students. And sometimes, I think that we have lacked that in Georgia and certainly in other states as well. In terms of bipartisanship, first of all, I'll say one thing pretty clearly. Until just a few years ago, Republicans held a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate, and we had a Republican governor, and it was no less easy to pass reforms or choice. So while yes, sometimes you might say that one party is a little more resistant, we could have had all of the reform and choice that we wanted under Republican control if it were just a Republican idea, and it's just not. In my experience, we do have a lot more Democrats in the state of Georgia that are receptive to public charter schools and possibly even some virtual education, but still bristle at the concept of private school choice, publicly funded private school choice. And there's a lot of reason for that. And some of that we've kind of talked about. It goes back to, systemic racism and a belief, a long held one, that private schools were a way, for folks to get out of segregating education, not in the too distant past. So that's a real concern, but we have a reality at this point that we've acknowledged where not every child has access to the same educational experience. And so when you're trying to bring everybody up to a certain level so that they can have access, I'm with, some that have asked questions like, why aren't there riots in the streets over this? I mean, and I've said that, for years, not just because of what's happening currently, but we do have some Democrats more in the House than in the Senate in the state of Georgia that are supportive of all the types of things that we've been talking about, but it's too few. And I think that is some of the great work that we are engaged in and have to be. To Governor Bush's point, this cannot be just sort of one leader's idea and then it goes away when that person's not in charge anymore, nor can it be one party's idea and therefore it go away when that party's not in charge anymore. If it's going to be sustainable and, really do for students over the long haul what it needs to, it's just got to be something that everybody comes to understand and embrace. And I think that's, our big challenge, and certainly a huge chunk of the work that I do at the state capitol is helping to educate lawmakers. I think the thing that is most successful, and so this is my plea for help for any of our Georgia folks that are watching this call, is I can go down there and talk till I'm blue in the face, but I think the thing that really makes a difference for policymakers, I'm sure Governor Bush can expound on this, is when they hear from parents, when they look in the eyes of a mom who's struggling, saying, please don't stand in the way, between my son and this opportunity. When they can visit a school and see the remarkable work that's being conducted by a private school in South Atlanta serving 100% low-income minority students. I mean, that's not everyone's perception of what private schooling looks like. So I think a lot of it is you have to see, touch, and experience the people and sometimes even the schools to really understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And so the more that we can provide those touch points, I think the more successful we'll be.
I'd add very quickly that the faith community can play a really constructive role. Our corporate tax scholarship program, a majority of the schools are in low-income communities that are faith-driven, and it's constitutionally protected, and they become the biggest advocate for these programs. It changes the whole dynamic when the church leader, who also is the school leader, says that this will help us sustain our role in this community, whether it's low-income Hispanic pastors or African-American pastors. It has been an important alliance for school choice. The schools in Florida that participate in this, they're not the fancy, suburban private schools. These are schools that are typically attached to churches, and they're in the communities. And then the other place is my team, the Catholic Church, there are many Catholic dioceses now that are closing Catholic schools, particularly in a time like this. By the way, the CARES Act, a good place to be providing support is supporting private schools during these times, because there's going to be an avalanche of kids going back to public schools because the private schools can't sustain their model. And so if you want to have a huge crisis, eliminate all private schools. See how that works out for the public school system.
Well, thank you.
I saw in, I'm sorry, Randy, I know we're running out of time, but I did see in Governor DeSantis issuing a statement that part of the CARES Act funding in Florida would go for scholarships directly for low-income families to help them sort of meet their private school tuition obligations, so that that's not happening, so that those students aren't disrupted from their environment, and also there's not such a huge burden on the public system having to absorb all of those students back. So I loved seeing that, and I wish more governors were doing it.
Absolutely.
Well, Governor, thank you so much for joining us for this call. I want to thank everybody who joined us for this as well. I mean, there were many more questions that were excellent, and I wish we had time for. Thank you for participating. If you want to get involved, feel free to contact us. For all the reasons Jamie mentioned, there's value in that. And Governor, I don't know if there's any last comment you have for our visitors.
Sure. For those that are participating, stroke a check, provide support for this incredibly important organization. I'm involved in a foundation, and in this time, it's not easy to get through this for lots of not-for-profits that do really good work, and the Georgia Center for Opportunity certainly is one of those. So if you like what you believe their mission is, don't just talk about it, act on it and write a check.
Well, thank you, Governor. And we did not ask him to say that, but we are
We
grateful.
didn't. I would also say, Governor, you're involved, you're the chairman of the Foundation for Excellence in Education, which is a great partner for us here in the state. We work with Excel in Ed quite well here in Georgia to advance all of these things. And I, would be curious how our viewers and listeners could connect and follow your work as well.
Sure, it's Excel in Ed, www.excelined, or you can email me directly at jeb@jeb.org, and you can stroke a check to the Foundation for Excellence in Education if you like.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you, everybody.